Peace. Peace. I don't want to go anywhere else. Do you? Sometimes, though, it's hard to find peace. Where we find it is just where we just found it, which is inside ourselves. But we're not yet only inside ourselves. And the world intrudes very loudly, very annoyingly, very disturbingly. I don't really watch the news that much, but it's really hard to seal myself off. And I'm not sure that, well, frankly, I don't necessarily want to be totally disconnected from the world in which I'm living. You know, I'm here. That is a big part of my life, my awareness, my purpose, somehow, is to be here, in this place, in this time, and to grow in peace and in love and in service. Even when the soil and the air and the water don't seem so ideal, I have to say, one of the thoughts that has been bothering me over the last couple of weeks is, you know, I've felt kind of inundated, has been a wondering, a doubt. I feel like my peeps, like the people that I'm with, like the people that want peace, that really have that as a high value, we're outnumbered. I mean, that candidate who knocked down the reporter and then the next day won the election, like, hello? It feels uncomfortable. And, you know, there are moments every day when I feel that discomfort. And the first thing I know from what I've learned spiritually, what I've learned here, what I've learned from unity, is, okay, that feeling, that thought, I'm outnumbered, I can't do anything, it's only going to come true in my life if I buy into it. And during that week-long, month-long, 2 months long, however, that immersion, that marathon, one of the most useful things I learned was the phrase, that idea has no power over me. It's a really good one. And Nancy and I have had lots of opportunities over this time to practice that. That idea has no power over me. I kind of want to put it, I haven't yet, but it'd be a good thing to put up on the mirror, wouldn't it? That thought has no power over me. I have to say some of the thoughts I don't want to have any power over me happen when I look in the mirror. It wouldn't be a bad place to put it. That's one of the things we can really do in response to feelings such as that overwhelm. That thought has no power over me. I am one with love. I am love. Where does that love come from? It's universal. It doesn't always show up in day-to-day events. It often doesn't show up because there's a lot of people who aren't thinking that way. And their thoughts are coming through too. So, comes back to, are we in the minority? And how big of a problem is it? Well, another thing I've been learning is that there are divine laws. There are universal principles. And whatever is happening in the everyday, grimble of life doesn't have any power over that. That is unchanging. And we can always go within and find the unchanging love, the unchanging peace, the unchanging laws, which do somehow also determine how things work in the physical realm. The same laws apply in spirit as in matter. An example that was used a number of times in Scripture is a good example. Yeast. What can be more humble than yeast, right? It's this stuff that tastes funny that you make bread with. It's very humble. But it illustrates a divine principle. What happens when you put yeast into a batch of flour? Suddenly, it changes. It changes its nature. It rises. This little bitty bit of yeast can activate the rising power of a whole bunch of flour. And it's kind of hard to prevent that happening once the yeast comes in contact with the flour. It just happens. In terms of molecules, would you say the yeast is in the majority? But it happens. We are yeast. There you go. Yeast illustrates a divine principle that disturbing the ongoing waves, the ongoing energy, inertia. It disturbs inertia. And when the ongoing stuff is disturbed, it can't keep going like it was. I read a fascinating article. I think it was in the New York Times. It's fun to read the New York Times. There's always interesting stuff. It was several days ago. And it was a reanalysis of how did the Allies, in other words, Russia and the US and Britain, and how did the Allies win World War II? Well, of course, we had superior military power. Apparently, that's not why we won. It wasn't our army, it wasn't our navy, it wasn't even our bombs. When they analyzed the actual history of battles and engagements and events, you know what came up as the most powerful reason why the tide turned and the Allies won? It was the resistance. Little local networked groups of people who were disrupting, who were taking down pilots and finding ways to get them back to Britain so they could fight again, who were feeding information to the Allied intelligence so that they knew what the Germans were doing. And this wasn't just in France. The resistance that we know, that I know, was all over France, but it was in Germany, it was in Holland, it was in Denmark, it was in Belgium. It was all over Europe. And they were all connected. And they were totally under the radar. It wasn't because we won in this big conflict and busted up the other side. It was the disruptors. Think about civil rights in this country. Yeah, we still have a long way to go, but think back to the 50s. Think back to the 60s. Think back to Greensboro with a bunch of black and white college students sitting in at Woolworths. They were disruptors. They were among many groups of disruptors. And as they all worked and expressed their values, it made a big change in the powers that reigned at the time. It dissolved them. We're getting rid of some of the last vestiges now with the statues that honored Civil War Confederate slave-owning generals and victories. But that happened, that turning point happened because of small groups of dedicated disruptors who weren't afraid, who took action. Were they outnumbered and outpowered in every way? And yet, they persevered. In the natural world, look at vaccines. Vaccines. What is the principle that a vaccine uses? It gives you a little bitty dose. Homeopathy works the same way, by the way. Gives you a little bitty dose and immunizes you against a potentially fatal infection. And I am not an advocate of vaccines in this day and age, but historically, it's a brilliant idea. And it has made a huge difference in public health. You have to give them credit. And it's the same subversive disruptor idea. Little bitty bit. The idea of herd immunity that also goes with vaccines. It's the same principle. This is a universal principle. I first learned about it, really, to think about it, I don't know, sometime in the 70s or 80s when I was learning organizational development. And I learned about the so-called Pareto principle, the 80-20 law. You know, 80% of your results comes from 20% of your efforts. Who knows the validity of the numbers? It's never been experimented with so that we know the exact percentages. But it's the same basic principle. You get a little bit of disruption that hits in exactly the right place, that hits an area where there's readiness. And a little bit can change a whole lot. Have you ever wondered how it came to be that so much of the world is influenced by either Muslim culture or Christian culture? You ever wondered about that? Doesn't that seem a bit odd? As to me. Well, it's the same story. The Roman Empire, within the 100 years after Jesus' death, life in the Roman Empire became horrible for most people. They say 3 out of 4 people throughout the Roman Empire were slaves. If you're a woman and your husband died, you were immediately forced into prostitution. Yeah, I mean, most people, at least 80% of people, probably more, didn't have even the basic necessities. If you died, nobody buried you. They might have thrown you out of town. But you didn't get a ceremony and a burial. Who was going to do that? I mean, it's way bottom, third world, off the bottom of the paradigm for us. That's what life was like. The Roman Empire was one of the biggest governments ever. It included a huge percentage of the Mediterranean basin and all the lands that, touched lands that eventually touched the Mediterranean. And I've heard different stories about how come the Roman Empire fell. I've heard stories about lead, right? That they used lead pipes. Plumbing was fantastic for those people that had money. But they killed themselves off. But looking at scholarly research about how did Christianity come to dominate, there's pretty much agreement now that, it came from nowhere and it spread like wildfire in less than 100 years. It toppled the whole Roman Empire. How did that happen? Well, in that early time when everything was so terrible, people had no dignity, people had no hope. There's another basic principle, another universal principle that was operating, that always operates. Universal principles operate all the time. And that principle was every being, every creature, Mother Earth included, has an innate sense of wholeness, of what that means. So that, antibiotics work on that principle, for instance. Somebody who's at death's door, and it's an infection, and a effective antibiotic is given in a large enough dose, they are no longer being suppressed. Their vital force is no longer suppressed by the pathogen, whatever it is. People bounce back. They go through amazing processes. They're always going toward restoring wholeness. Nobody has to tell us what direction that lies in. Nobody has to tell us, what does it feel like to be healthy? Should I go that way? Should I go that way? Maybe I should go that way. We know. People know. Earth knows. We have that innate wholeness in us because everything is an expression of the same spirit, the same awareness. And it's the awareness that determines what happens. So what was going on back there in the Roman Empire? All these people, as I think I would, probably most of you, were saying, this isn't right. You know, this just shouldn't be this way. There should be justice. We should have. It shouldn't all belong to them. We should have our basic needs. So there was an awareness, a need, a really strongly felt need. And these little groups of Greek-speaking Jews were following a dude named Paul and learning, they were adapting Judaism. They were adapting the moral values of Judaism, which were widely respected in the world at that time as humane, as just, and fortuitously, the Hebrew Testament had been, by that time, translated into Greek, so everybody could read it. And these Greek-speaking Jews, following the teachings of a penniless preacher from Palestine, who was also a Jew, who was also adapting, who was also pushing forward Hebraic teachings. You know, they weren't kooks because they were Jews, and everybody respected the Jews. But into that misery, that general misery, they introduced a couple of things that were irresistible. They invited people to become members of their community. And when one of these people, whether it was a slave woman or somebody from the streets, became a member of their community, they treated them with respect. They offered love. They helped them to find a better way of living. They helped them gain resources. You can't resist that kind of help. You can't resist love. And they didn't. And the divine realm that these small groups, new groups of Christians, Judaic Christians, introduced. Well, you look at the idea of heaven, you look at the idea of total love, and you've experienced nothing like that in your life, but you know that's right. That's what really is true. You want it. You join up. You help. So between service and kindness, in something like 70 years, the Christians toppled the whole Roman Empire. And 200 years later, 200 or 300 years later, just to prove that, yeah, this really works this way, Islam did the same thing with the rest of the Mediterranean basin and spread like wildfire and toppled everything else. So there you have it. But again, it was small groups of networked disruptors living what they believed that brought change way beyond their apparent numerical power because of divine principles that always work. So one of the things I'm having a lot of fun exploring at this point is, okay, so what are those divine principles? There's lots of them. But it's kind of giving me some insight into, you know what? There is some reliability here. I really can trust because of those divine principles. I can use them. I can use them in my life. I can use them in community life. I need to be aware of them to use them. You know, that's where the heart is powerful, the heart is wonderful, and the head helps. You know, it helps to know why you want to do this here. Another basic principle that we've alluded to before 2 or 3 times in the last several months is that conflict breeds desire, right? I don't like this. I want something else. Here's what I want. You never get it by doing this. Doesn't work. The only plausible, the only successful solution to this kind of conflict is to go to a higher level, to go within, to process the situation from a whole different perspective, which we can call spiritual, which we can call divine, which we can call universal, which we can call sacred, which we can also call real and effective. So, as we process things like, I think it's next Friday, we're all being called to be mindful all day long of gun violence in America. What's that going to do? Huh? What's that going to do? It'll create more gun violence because more people are thinking about it. What might we do instead as people aware that we want to practice peace rather than wage war? Think about peace, yes. That thought of gun violence, first thing to say, it has no power over me. Gun violence? What about it? No power over me. Right. Why? Because it's a thought, and I choose to think. I choose to be aware that I am one with love. And therefore, I know how to find that lovable aspect of everybody. Even the people I think that like to shoot. That thought has no power over me, right? That thought has no power over me. I am practicing peace. What does that mean? In your program, there's a little handout that lists, 4 possible ways to practice peace. I'm going to invite you to engage in these practices this week, anyway. Deny that violent thoughts have any power over us, and affirm that all beings, including Mother Earth, are one expression of divine energy. All beings, whether I like them or not, whether I think I agree with them or not, are one expression of divine energy. Disrupt violent thoughts and actions, our own and others that we see, by actively practicing kindness. It's not opposition, it's going above, which melts the opposition. Actively practicing kindness toward first ourselves. Oh, I'm so tired, but I should be kind. That's where it starts. Have compassion for yourself. You can't have compassion for others unless we have it for ourselves. We don't know what it is unless we have it for ourselves. Third, we have back there about maybe 600 kindness buttons. Hey, they're a useful, visible reminder, right? Remind ourselves and remind others that we are practicing peace. So I bagged up some buttons. There's some baggies there with 5 or 6 buttons in them. There's also a pile of baggies and another 500 buttons. So I invite you at the end of the service, either take one of the baggies or take a baggie and fill it up with buttons. And use them as badges of recognition for everybody who wants to practice kindness. Just find who wants to practice kindness. They'll let you know in different ways. Give them out. Ask them who they know. Give them enough so they can give them to their friends. They're not doing us any good sitting in a plastic bag in the closet. And finally, living every day from our connection with the absolute realm of divine love. That's enough for a week, don't you think? So, together, let's be powerful disruptors this week. Let's, realize the power of yeast. Let's be yeast. You're right. We are yeast in our surrounding culture of violence. We are sowing little seeds of peace that can't help but spread, because they're really what people want in their deepest selves. So we've got the principle of wholeness, the principle of yeast. We're going to use them to make a difference. And right now, we are realizing that because of those two divine principles, peace is going to prevail. And we are going to be effective disruptors. And so it is.